Hang on a second. Yep. Well, good morning. I have no idea whether I'm talking to live streamers, but in case I am, I just want the live streamers to know you do not have to adjust the video settings. I am not Roger Klein. I'm David Singer. Sorry? Yeah, there is a microphone. Does it work? Okay. So let's see. First order of business, I want to thank Doris Donnelly, who is not here this morning, but she provided us with the bagels that we're all enjoying. And I want to thank Paul Sobel for picking up the bagels. So let's begin with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. We thank you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engage in the study of Torah. Amen. So, before I start, I feel a moral obligation to thank my rabbi, without whom I would not be here, Rabbi David Haken, who perhaps some of you knew, was my rabbi for many, many years. Before I met him, he was my wife Vivian's rabbi when she was a little girl, and when we were married in 1966, he performed the ceremony. When we moved to Cleveland, more precisely when I dragged my wife kicking and screaming to Cleveland in 1975, he was here as the regional rabbi of the what was then the UAHC, is now the URJ, and he steered me towards Fairmount Temple, and he created a Torah study group, of which Viv and I were the very much junior members. And it was from him that I first learned how to study Torah. I remember in particular one Shabbaton that we had at Punderson, where there was a special teaching session led by Rabbi Roger Klein. So that was my first experience of studying with Rabbi Klein, and I've had many happy occasions to study with him since. So I want to just recite one verse from the Kaddish de Rabbanan in their honor. So this is an English translation of it. Upon Israel and upon our teachers and upon their students and upon all the students of their students and upon all those who occupy themselves with Torah, whether in this place or in each and every other place, May there be for them and for you abundant peace, grace, and goodness and mercy, long life, sufficient sustenance and redemption from their loving parent who is in heaven and earth. And we say, Amen. So 2 weeks ago, Roger approached me after Torah study and asked if I would be willing to lead a session. Now, I've never done this before. I have many times given a Devar Torah, but never a whole class. But I thought, well, okay, that sounds like an interesting challenge. And I happened to know that particular Torah portion that was coming up very well. That's Va'era. And I knew there were lots of nice things I could say about it. For example, if you listen to someone reading Torah week after week, there's a large number of Torah portions that begin Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe, Vayomer elav. So, and Adonai spoke to Moses saying, but Va'era starts out Vayidaber Elohim el Moshe. It's the only time it's ever written that way. And I thought, okay, so that's a fun thing to talk about for a while. And there are various other interesting aspects to it. So I was pretty comfortable with agreeing to do this. So not too long afterwards, I got word from Roger. He said, oh, I made a mistake. It's not next week, it's the week after. Well, the week after is Bo. Now, in my opinion, Bo is maybe the single nastiest Torah portion of them all. I mean, okay, God becomes a mass murderer, wiping out the firstborn of all the Egyptians. In the process, he tells the Israelites to lie to their Egyptian neighbors and borrow stuff which they're going to take away, and they're not going to return. And then God sends the Israelites off in the wrong direction. And then God changes the direction and sends them right to the edge of the Red Sea. Why? So that he can kill some more Egyptians. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a really tricky portion. So I've spent 2 weeks sweating over this, and I do not expect to succeed in convincing you that all of that stuff is fine, but maybe I can point us in some slightly hopeful directions. So what I want to do is I want to pick out a few particular verses in the text and talk about them. And the first one is particularly innocuous, and that's Exodus 12, verse 15, which reads, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the very first day you shall remove leaven from your houses, and whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Okay, well, we're familiar with this, right? Because we observe this every year on Pesach. So, no big deal, right? However, if instead you go to Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 8, so let me find that. Okay, verse 8 rather. After eating unleavened bread 6 days, you shall hold a solemn gathering for the Lord your God on the seventh day. You shall do no work. So are you not supposed to eat leavened bread for 7 days? Or are you supposed to not eat leavened bread for 6 days? Yes?
Another sort of nuance is the commandment in Deuteronomy is to eat matzah, but it doesn't say not to eat leavened bread. It's just a commandment you should eat matzah. Whereas in Exodus, it's very clear you're not supposed to eat anything leavened.
First read verse 4.
By the way, I appreciate people interrupting me. The more the better. What's verse 4, Vivian?
So verse 4 in my translation says, "And you shall not have leaven appear within all your borders for 7 days."
Well,
Okay.
The penalty is quite explicit in Exodus. The shall, we'll figure out how to interpret that. But anyway, it's clear that those are very different, not only the numeric pieces of it, but the exclusion of leaven and the penalties are not mentioned really in the Deuteronomy.
Exactly.
Perhaps it just reflects, Deuteronomy reflects practice in the settled land. If you believe that Deuteronomy is something that is a much later book and reflects perhaps the Babylonian experience, they're just acknowledging what people actually did.
Right. So as Steve points out, there is definitely a contradiction between what's going on in Exodus and what's going on in Deuteronomy. And how do we deal with that? Well, we have lots of arguments about it, actually. The question of how long the holiday that we call Pesach lasts. It's interesting that certainly growing up, it never, I was not aware of the fact that it's really 2 holidays, one on top of the other. The text makes it clear that the first night, the night that we have the Seder, is the Pesach. It's the observation of the eating of the Paschal lamb. And then, so the text says on the 14th day of the month, we observe this holiday of Pesach, and then 7 days after that, we observe the feast of the unleavened bread. So it's 2 holidays, one on top of the other, not one holiday, and so it took a lot of work by the rabbis to explain what the relationship between unleavened bread and Pesach was. But, okay, there's a certain amount of confusion here. So now let me give you a slightly more confusing example, which is right nearby. This is Exodus chapter, Exodus chapter 12, verse 8 says, I think I'm using a microphone. Okay, I don't know how to make it louder. I'll try to talk up. So 12:8. It says, they shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. They shall eat it roasted over the fire. However, if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 16, so here we are again, and this time it's chapter 16, verse 7. Sorry, I have a typo.
Page 300.
Let's see. It says in verse 7, Okay, in this translation it says, "You shall cook and eat it at the place that Lord your God will choose." And the word cook, according to authoritative sources, means that you boil it and eat it. Okay, so do you roast it or do you boil it? Well, going back to Exodus 12, verse 9, it says, "Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in any way with water, but roast it." So you are commanded not to boil it in one place, and you are commanded to boil it in the other place. So oy vey, what do we do about this? Okay, well, this is a lead-in to a really wonderful article that I want to tell you about in a very interesting book called "These Truths We Hold: Judaism in an Age of Truthiness." And there's an article in this book written by Benjamin D. Summer entitled, "Can the Torah Still Be a Source of Truth?" And Summer's thesis attempts to explain these contradictions. And he says that the point is that the Torah is not a single narrative given by Moses, but rather what he calls an anthology, a collection of different stuff that's been brought together. And he argues that really we should be following what he calls a participatory theology of revelation as opposed to a stenographic theology. I love that term. A stenographic theology, that means Moses took down everything that God said. It was dictated to him. He wrote it down and gave it to us, including, of course, everything up to his death. And after his death, he was still taking down this notation. So that's one traditional view. So Summer calls that the stenographic theology. And what he says is that the way we should understand the Torah is that it was put together out of the recollections and understandings of various people over time. After all, leaving aside the question of who wrote the Bible, before it was written down, it was an oral Torah. And the thing about oral traditions is that they get messed up a little bit depending on the memories of the people who are carrying this knowledge from one generation to the next. And so there are different versions of the story. And what's interesting about the Torah is that it does not try to reconcile these different versions. It includes contradictions within the text without trying to resolve those contradictions. It starts at the very beginning. We know that when we read Bereshit, chapter 1 tells us about the creation story, including the creation of Adam and Eve, and then we get a different story in chapter 2 immediately. So if you're starting the book at the beginning of Bereshit, you already see that there's a contradiction, or at least something that has to be resolved. Summer gives other examples. He refers, for example, to Noah and the question of how many animals did we bring on the ark? The animals, there was supposed to be a pair of animals of each kind, or a few verses later, 7 pairs of some animals. And so is it 1 pair? Is it 7 pairs? I don't know. So what Summers is arguing is that we have to consider this story as being not clear because of differing perceptions of what happened. And that's particularly clear when we get to the story of Sinai, because when God speaks to the people from Mount Sinai, a lot of the people don't get it. In fact, they don't even want to hear it. And some people do hear it. So people hear different versions of what God said on Mount Sinai. In fact, supposedly God spoke in simultaneously multiple languages, and different people heard the same words in different languages. Now, there's always an issue of translation when you switch from one language to another. And so if you only know one language and you are trying to understand what's in another language, you have to fix it by translation. And all translations are mistakes in the sense that they lose some of the ideas. There's an interesting example that I found in our portion, which is, let me see if I can locate it. Yes, okay, so we go to Exodus 10, verse 28. So the text is very interesting here. It says, Pharaoh said to him, "Be gone from me. Take care not to see me again, for the moment you look upon my face, you shall die." And Moses replied, "You have spoken rightly. I shall not see your face again." Now that's what this translation is in English. If you look at it in Hebrew, you discover, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, I generally refer to my wife when I have questions about Hebrew, but the phrase about seeing me again, so Vivian, what's the Hebrew for seeing me again? Od. Okay, but there's lo el tasef ra'ot hanecha. Osef. So Pharaoh uses osef, and Moses replies, what? He says, Lo osef. Well, we know that word osef. That's Joseph, right? So one way of understanding what Pharaoh said was, no more Joseph. And Moses replies, you got that right. There's no more Joseph. And then, if you read a few verses later, you learn that when Moses gets ready to leave, one of the important things he does is he takes Joseph's bones. And what's the significance of that? Joseph is leaving Egypt. And that's really important because it's the bookend to the story that starts with the story of Joseph. They're in Egypt because of Joseph, they're leaving Egypt, and basically we're saying, no more Joseph in Egypt. Now, I don't know what you want to make of that, but the point I'm making is that if you don't read it in Hebrew, if you read it in English, you miss little nuances. I mean, it's not an accident, I don't think, that the words being used by Pharaoh and Moses refer to Joseph, because this is the story of Joseph. So,
Can I ask you a question?
please,
I want you to back up a little bit.
yeah.
Tell me about the time that the Torah was codified, and if everybody agreed that the words are the same in Hebrew at that time, and if that's continued, or if this difference in meaning is only transliteration when it was translated from Hebrew into English, that the discrepancy exists.
Well,
I mean, what's the same and what's different? And when
So-
did it happen?
so as far as what is the Hebrew text, the best we know is that what we have in this Tanakh is the codified version of Torah. I mean, what's in the scroll back there, that's the same Hebrew that's in here. Now,
Okay.
I
So
mean,
the Hebrew is
the-
standard, or?
yes, the Hebrew is standard. The translations into different languages are not standard.
And that's what makes it.
Well,
more
but
simple.
no, it's not. It's that there's any translation at all that makes it questionable. I mean, you can look for other translations of the verses I just read. You won't see any reference to Joseph in any translation that I'm aware of into English, because you're translating the name into another language, and so it ceases to be a name. In other words, the fact that the word for no more is the same as the word for the patriarch Joseph.
So
Oh.
it has to do with addition. Yosef, the reason he was named Yosef was, Rachel said, I've added something. Okay? And this says, so here they're talking about ever seeing again in English, but what he says is you're not gonna add to the times you've seen me again. So
Okay.
even if you added the word add into that sentence, you wouldn't see Yosef.
Oh, so, okay,
It's
so
the meaning
Joseph
of the
means two
name.
different things. It means the name Joseph and
And the meaning of the name.
the meaning, okay, and the meaning of the name. Okay, you didn't make that clear initially to me.
Well, that's no surprise.
Okay. And so now I understand the point that you're making is in the translation.
Right, thank you. Yeah.
But that's not an uncommon thing in any name situation, like the name Rose in English is also the name of a flower. So there's punning that could happen with names all over. But I wanted to come back to something you were saying, that is, if we say this is a revealed word and it varies, the story is different, not just different, but contradicts.
Yes.
That raises the question of authority and, who speaks for this tradition and with what power. So I'm thinking back in the days of the kings, they could say, hey, this is real text, everything we're doing is strictly from God, and you can't question what we do, that's where they got their authority. In the age of the rabbis, they would say, well, we have studied the text more than you, and so we have some authority because we have a definitive or authoritative approach to understanding the text. But then comes Martin Luther and he says, well, truth resides in anyone's interpretation, which we've inherited, and certainly in the Reform movement, there's a sense that we're freed from rabbinic authority. We learn from rabbis, but it's not as though they're written as law. And I think we still struggle with that idea of authority. In other words, who says we have to do something a certain way? And how does the text actually have power to coerce? And you're saying right at the very beginning, there's a weakness in the, I mean, if it's...
I'm not saying it's a weakness, I'm saying it's a feature.
So that's the question, does that make it weakness?
So,
If there's actual contradiction, because you can't say, well, God said, Pesach is 7 days, so you can't argue with me on that. If God says 6 here and 7 here, then does God really say it either way?
well, yeah. Yes, Steve?
In partial answer, you could imagine that someone was trying to collect the stories of our people that had been orally transmitted, and they wanted, sort of from an anthropological standpoint, let's just make sure that we get these things written down. And then many years later, we say, this is our canon, this is our holy book. Because the original purpose of getting it all written down wasn't to establish authority. They were just trying to say, this is our story. So let's make sure that it has some permanence so that we can transmit it from generation to generation. Doesn't mean maybe the original intent wasn't that we're trying to make a holy book. That was later. To answer your story, why are there so many contradictions? Well, the book had been written down for so many generations. They didn't feel like at the time that they were going to canonize it that they had the ability to start editing it at that point. It became canon because of its ancient nature. So they couldn't edit it. They just said, okay, we'll just interpret it to try to, the rabbinic story, we'll try to interpret it as best we can to kind of smooth over some of the contradictions, but we're not going to change the text itself.
Well, that's one possible way of looking at it. I'd like to share with you Summer's view of it, if I may. Because remember, I'm looking at a book about truth. And the question is, is the Torah true? Can we still rely on the truth in the Torah? And we have this dilemma, because if it says one thing in one place and something else in another place, then the temptation is to say, well, we can't believe anything, because who knows? So here's what Summer has to say, and he says it a lot better than I could say it. He says, the theory of truth that underlies the Torah, then, reminds us of the incomplete nature of our own perceptions, as well as of the incomplete or flawed nature of Torah itself. God's will may be perfect, but humanity's understanding of God's will, can only be imperfect. As a result, we're best served by an anthology of these imperfect perceptions, which affords us the wisdom of the crowd that is the Jewish people, or Kalal Yisrael. With this conclusion, a key distinction emerges between the stenographic theology of Revelation and the participatory one. For the stenographic theory, specifics of the law, and to a lesser extent, Judaism's theological and ethical beliefs, either come directly from heaven or follow from interpretations based on the precise wording of a text whose every letter, vowel, and cantillation mark were penned by God. If the specifics of halakha come directly from God or are a single exegetical step removed from God, then the extent to which human authorities can change these specifics will be limited. To be sure, one of the details of the halakhic system is that Jews are to follow the rulings of each generation's sages, and thus the possibility of modest change within the system exists within the stenographic theory. But sages committed to that theory are likely to alter the system only with the greatest hesitancy. Furthermore, if as an adherent to the stenographic theory, one is sure that the details of the law one observes come from heaven, then one may believe one's actions correspond precisely to the will of God. This belief risks fostering an extraordinary spiritual confidence, which can easily devolve into arrogance. There is nothing more dangerous than a human being who thinks he knows exactly what the deity wants, and nothing more lacking in the humility that our created status should engender. Evidence abounds demonstrating the correlation between certainty regarding God's will and tendencies toward arrogance, inflexibility, intolerance, and even religiously motivated violence. So Summers' view very clearly is that the nature of Torah is deliberately ambiguous in order that we not develop the arrogant belief that we know what God wants. Lou.
It's my understanding that much of the commentaries that, if you look at a traditional Chumash, you'll see there's a few lines of Torah and then there's all kinds of commentaries as to reconcile these differences, these inconsistencies in the Torah, to come to some conclusion that, this makes it, consistent with this here if you interpret it this way. And so, for example, I was looking at the 6th day versus the 7th day. The one commentary says it's because of the counting of the Omer. So there's something particular about counting the Omer. When you're counting the Omer, you can't use newly harvested things. You have to use old and harvested things. Food stuff, to make matzah, and so that's my understanding of this abundance of commentaries. Is that one of the purposes is to reconcile things like this. So in regard to that, I was going. Permit me to go back for a second. Is the chapter 12 verse 9? Does that mean it's not kosher to eat brisket on Passover because it's like a stew versus like a roast? Because it's cooked in liquid. So would that be a proper interpretation?
Well, I think it would be, yes. But let me say in response to what you're saying, it may be the intent of the Talmud and other documents to try to reconcile different, apparently contradictory rules. That may be the intent, but we allow minority views on everything. The commentaries don't necessarily resolve contradictions. It's really fun when you read passages in the Talmud where it says, Rabbi so-and-so says this, and Rabbi so-and-so says, that's totally wrong. Okay, we have Rashi arguing with Ibn Ezra, arguing with Nachmanides. They don't agree. And we don't say at the end, okay, but Nachmanides was right and Ibn Ezra was wrong. We provide both of them. And in fact, that's Summers' point about the participatory theology, which is we allow multiple interpretations. Steve.
Well, I think it's, that's the nature of the beast. It's like, you're gonna get 5 opinions with 4 people. Kind of thing.
But we allow them. That's the
Allow it,
point.
Right. There's nothing that says Rashi is, reigns over everyone. So we
Yeah,
must
well, in
take
fact,
Rashi's interpretation.
there's this famous story of the rabbis who are having an argument, and one person is saying, if I'm right, let there be a heavenly voice that tells me, and a heavenly voice says he's right, and the other rabbis say, we don't listen to heavenly voices, right? And at the end they say, it says in the Torah, it's not in the heavens. So it's up to us to decide. It's not up to you, it's up to us.
God laughs.
And God laughs, that's right. Yes.
I appreciate the author is saying it's a feature that the 5 books have contradictions, and that's so that we don't try to be sort of get the sense that we know God's will. That sort of sounds good, but as our discussion is going, it's quite clear that we are an argumentative people. People, I sort of think he's putting up a straw man of the rigid biblical authority, but in practical matters, I think we always have arguments. On the flip side, if you're a small Jewish community and you don't have time to spend your days reading Torah and Talmud, when you have a question, you go to your local rabbi and say, what does it say? Now, whether the rabbis assert their authority and say, I know what it is and you will follow what I say, is kind of where you're, essentially we as less learned Jews are giving up a bit of our freedom by asking an authority for that. But I don't sort of buy his argument that it's, there's this tendency to sort of this rigidity of interpretation, and that the flaws or flaws or inconsistencies are built in. It sort of feels a little artificial in terms of its, I'm going to imagine that there's all this rigidity, but that's sort of the straw man that I'm putting up. So the text itself has inconsistencies on that score. So I'm saying I don't quite buy the argument.
Well, I'm not sure I've presented his full argument. There's
Okay.
a long article, so let me quote just a little bit more. He says, the frank acknowledgement that the Torah is a multivocal human document, more an anthology than a book, frequently prone to contradict itself and at times prone to error, does not have to preclude us from accepting it as a sacred text. But it does tell us that truth is something we strive for more than something we can possess. I think that's the argument he's making.
So, 2 points. One is, I just looked it up, just to make sure I wasn't off on this, but there is a tradition of a 7-day holiday containing 2 holidays. So Sukkot, when the temple stood, was a 7-day holiday everywhere, and the last day was Hoshana Rabbah. So
Yeah.
Sukkot is a 7-day holiday, or a 6-day holiday followed by Hoshana Rabbah. So there's a parallel to this passage, I think in Deuteronomy it was, where Pesach looks like it's 6 days, but it does say the 7th day is a holiday.
Yeah.
And it suggests, like Hoshana Rabbah, there's some ambiguity. Is it the 7th day of Pesach or its own separate holiday? Like Hoshana Rabbah could be the 7th day of Sukkot or its own holiday, Hoshana Rabbah. But the other thing I was going to say is this raises an interesting question in addition to authority, which is the nature of truth. Is truth absolute that doesn't vary? And in some disciplines it would seem, you know better than a lot of us here, in math it seems as though truth, 2 plus 2 does equal 4 in most systems. And that doesn't
Don't get me started on that. I actually taught an entire semester course on truth in mathematics.
But if you-
It's a complicated story.
If you say truth isn't like sex, the power of truth? If truth is truth in each person's eyes, does it remain valuable?
Well, that's a dilemma we all have to struggle with, isn't it? I mean,
Truth is what say that again?
So one way of looking at truth is there's some truth out there independent of us. Like, it's not up to me whether the earth revolves around the sun, that's just how it is. Or truth is, well, isn't there a saying, truth in the eye of the beholder, that, each person's perspective is rich, and you can't deny the truth of someone's perspective. So from that point of view, truth varies from perspective to perspective.
so that's what this Torah study that we do every week is all about, right? We're trying to figure out what is true. Is anything true? If anything is true, what is it that's true? And I wish I had a way of answering that question, but I don't think any of us does. Yes?
One thing about Hebrew is that if you take 100 Hebrew words and translate it into English, it's going to be 200 English, maybe 300. So each word is packed with much more meaning in Hebrew than we understand, and I suspect even native Hebrew speakers today don't understand all the nuances of what's packed into one word compared to 500 BCE when the Torah was put together. So this doesn't talk about, it doesn't address the contradiction of 6 verses 7, but it addresses all this interpretive things and nuances that I think you English speakers totally miss, right, Vivian?
You know, we can debate whether there was a contradiction between the 6 and the 7. We can debate whether there was really a contradiction when Noah was bringing the animals on 2 by 2, whether having 7 pairs meant each individual one was a pair, and therefore he was bringing them in by 2. I only gave you some examples, mostly cited by Summer himself. But I think if we look hard enough, we can definitely find contradictions that we're going to not be able to resolve. One of the ones that we talk about every year is when Joseph is taken out of the pit by the Ishmaelites, or is it the Midianites? Okay, so we try to fix that and we say, yeah, well, what happened was the Ishmaelites got him and they sold him to the Midianites. Or maybe we just misread that. And I always found it really hard to deal with that particular passage, especially because then it refers to the Medanites. And who the heck are the Medanites? And that, is that a typo? Well, it's not typed, but, I mean, any individual apparent contradiction, people spend a lot of time trying to fix it up. And maybe you can fix every contradiction, but then again, maybe you can't. And it's the process of discussing it and trying to figure out what it means that's really, I think, what we're about in this group. As he says, as Summer says, that truth is something that you sort of work towards, but you can't actually get there. Yes, ma'am.
I think that the purpose of the Torah is to find truth. I mean, so I don't know, I think we're seeking not truth so much, but about the complexity of human life and of spirituality and whatever. It's not, I mean, the word truth, I don't think is a key point of our studying Torah.
It's difficult. Yes.
In the
Archie.
comparison about the preparation of the lamb, roasting, head, legs, and entrails. Do the entrails mean the kishkas?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, it hasn't been cleaned. Kosher clean the animal better, because if you boiled it back then with the entrails, it would fall. There are dramatic pauses in this document, this book, that give us like back doors to progressivism. It's letting us see how you progress. Forget the linguistics part, because I never figured that out. Low OSEF, all right?
Okay, I want to take on a few hard questions now, because as much as it's a temptation to just spend our time trying to reconcile things that frankly most of us don't care about one way or the other. Do you boil brisket or do you roast it? We have to look at more difficult things. Like, for example, what is with this hardening of the heart business? And I wish I had the answer to that question. When you go through the text during the 10 plagues, you find many instances where Pharaoh hardens his own heart, and then other instances where God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And I don't even understand the text in some places, because in one place it says, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So who did it that time? And what are we to make of it? I mean, don't we have a tendency to feel kind of manipulated? If God can influence people's attitudes about things, if God can do it with Pharaoh, then I guess God could do it with one of us at any time. And does God do stuff like that? And are we comfortable with God doing stuff like that? I find this problematic. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Would we be aware of it, that God hardened our hearts? Would we be aware that God had impacted us?
I don't know. Pharaoh doesn't seem to be aware of it. Michael.
Well, there's an assumption that in the absence of God's manipulation, we have free will.
Yeah.
And I personally think that's kind of narcissistic nonsense, or at least egocentric nonsense. I mean, our brains work a certain way, and they're not infinitely malleable. And so, in that sense, we're already manipulated. And then we can ascribe that to any source we want.
Okay.
So I guess I look at it as something where there's sort of layers of abstraction, and our hearts are hardened, or our hearts have the capacity to be hardened, whether there's an active teleological hand or not.
So what's the takeaway from that? What do we learn from
Well,
that?
I just don't think it's an either-or kind of question. In other words, it's leaving, I think the text is leaving it to us to interpret any number of ways. And so we can say, well, our hearts are not hardened in the absence of God, and then God comes in and hardens it. That's one extreme interpretation. The other is that God has given us the capacity to have a hardened heart anyway, and then it's sort of arbitrary as to whether we think God had a hand in it or not, right? Okay, I don't know if that's clear.
Steve, and then
So if you believe in God, you can sort of divide that up into exists, but God does not intervene in human affairs. If you say that God intervenes in human affairs, then the question is, does God intervene? Is God a moral God? Does God always act in ways that align with morality? And in this case, we're questioning whether God's intervening in hardening Pharaoh's heart was right. Is that a right action for God? It's very hard to say. At the extreme end, people would say anything that God does is by definition moral. Because when we ascribe morality, we are saying it is God's will. So it cannot be not moral.
Steve, that's a great lead-in to something I want to cite
Okay.
on this subject. This is Aviva Zornberg's view of the subject. Perhaps the most satisfactory approach is to keep the theological problems ever present. In the Particulars of Rapture, Reflections on Exodus, Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg suggests that the liberation story of the Israelites, what she calls the master narrative, gives rise to counter-narratives that throw the justification of God's triumphal power into question. Indeed, as Zornberg argues, the master narrative of God as loving and benevolent Redeemer of the Israelites is challenged by the killing of the Egyptians' firstborn, including the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. This prompts a counter-narrative from the perspective of the plague's victims that asks, what sin could the babies and the captives possibly have committed to deserve this punishment? The answer posits an evil God. This narrative appears again later in the story of the golden calf, when Moses convinces God not to murder the Israelites for their transgression, arguing that otherwise the Egyptian story will prevail. Let not the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he delivered them. Although the Midrash attempts to silence and neutralize potentially heretical answers to such queries, Zornberg maintains that the Torah, even God's quoted words, gives rise to interpretations that radically contradict its own master narrative, and that cannot, moreover, be totally repudiated by its accredited expositors. For Zornberg, an alternative for dealing with a dissonance between narrative and counter-narrative is the model of endless questioning, in which the answer does not totally silence the questioner. In fact, implicit and explicit questions play an important role in this parashah. God mandates that the story of the Exodus be told in response to children's queries. And when your children ask, you shall say. This is the basis for the Passover Seder's custom of the 4 questions. Further, 2 more verses from this parashah and 1 from Deuteronomy instructs us to answer our children's questions about the Exodus. The rabbis understood all these verses as referring to 4 kinds of children. The Haggadah's 4 sons, each with varying aptitudes, each eliciting a different perspective on the narrative. The wise son, the wicked son, the simple son, and the one who is unable to ask. And then Zornberg continues, and by the way, this is taken from the women's commentary on the Torah, that she says, through questions we might call forth another counter-narrative, the experience of women during the Exodus and its subsequent retelling, noting that the traditional Haggadah assumes a conversation between a father and 4 sons. Contemporary feminist Haggadot fill in the absence of women's voices. The Mayan Haggadah, for example, includes the 4 daughters. The daughter in search of a usable past asks, why did Moses say at Sinai, go not near a woman, addressing only men, as if preparation for revelation was not meant for us as well. The daughter who wants to erase her difference wonders about the importance of women's issues. The daughter who does not know that she has a place at the table asks, "What is this?" And the daughter who asks no question is told, "From the moment Yocheved, Miriam, and the midwives questioned Pharaoh's edict until today, every question we ask helps us to leave Egypt a little farther behind."
So Zornberg's comment made me think something I hadn't connected before, but you could argue there's something very important about the story of the death of the killing of the firstborn, and not just Seder, but our master narrative. So she's saying that the suffering in the master narrative is a part of the master narrative, can't be ignored. And if you think about it, there would be no Exodus, be no Jewish people, according to this narrative, without the death of the firstborn. And parsley at the Seder table is reminiscent of the hyssop that painted our lintel that was the shield against the plague of the death of the firstborn that allowed us to survive it. So there's, you can't escape it. It goes back to Cindy's point, it's structured for complexity. You know, there's a tapestry that I think at its heart tries to be complex, and you can't wiggle out of it. So, you know, we sort of wiggle a little bit, you know. We talk about the frogs more than the firstborn, and we talk about the plagues, and we dip the wine out, and we sort of, in some ways, pass over this story at the Seder. But Mary Zornberg's account reminds me it's really at the heart of it, you know. If you know, as Roger often does, if you think about the author sitting down writing it, he could have had a different story of release. And the other thing that comes to mind is almost all slave rebellions, successful or not, involve death. Like a system of oppression doesn't wield its power easily. It's usually some violence involved to even attempt liberation from the slave system. And all the successful ones, like the revolution in Haiti, were very deadly. So there's historically some validity to the idea that there'd be death involved in the liberation. But again, if it's God writing the story or God creating the master narrative, it is interesting that a human habit of violence to achieve liberation from slavery was used by God as well.
Chad?
Two comments. One is about evil God. You had mentioned it. You know, the original request to Pharaoh of Moses was to let his people go into the wilderness for 3 days, or Yahweh will kill us. That's, I mean, they say that unless you do this, it's not punishing Pharaoh. Yahweh's going to kill us, which I think is very striking. You know, why that is and why they say that, I don't understand. But certainly that's not what we're talking about. The second thing is about, I have a hard time with hardening of heart. But if you dumb it down and assume that whoever wrote this is writing from some kind of historical perspective, Egypt and Israel have a relationship where Egypt is fickle. The Pharaoh is, I use the word fickle. And I wrote these down because I never remember them. There are 4 times in the Hebrew Bible where Egypt promises or gets Israel to not pay tribute or something to the Assyrians or the Babylonians, and then doesn't come to defend. The first time is Hosea, and that was in 2 Kings. It's the fall of the kingdom. Egypt didn't show up. Second one is Hezekiah in 701, and actually Egypt did nothing when Assyria destroyed many cities, and actually I think that's one of the few archaeological digs that you can actually document at Lachish about this siege that the Assyrians
And yet,
Yeah.
as I understand it, when you get to Isaiah, God apparently makes a pact with Egypt, similar to what God has done with our people. So, I mean, we are not the eternal enemies of Egypt, according to the Tanakh, despite all the bad things that happened over the years. I mean, it's different.
When Jerusalem is destroyed, right, Jeremiah and a whole group of people with Jeremiah, where did they go? They went to Egypt.
Yeah, as I recall, Jeremiah didn't want to go to Egypt, though.
He did not want to go to Egypt.
He ended up in
Everyone
prison.
else did,
Yes.
so they overruled it.
Yeah. Interesting.
So you promised to help us understand why the plagues were okay.
Did I promise that?
You said you hoped to be able to convince us,
That the plagues were okay?
well, that this whole story is okay. I think that's how you started.
Well, perhaps you can explain the plagues for us. Yes?
No,
Oh.
not unless you have mine.
I do. One moment while I find it.
This is some research I did, but I didn't know if he was going to bring it up.
Well, I'm not sure I was going to, but
Well, maybe I misunderstood what you said at the beginning.
oh gosh.
I don't, it's okay.
Sorry, folks.
Vivian can do it, right?
Well, so,
Yeah.
what I found was in a book by a guy named Roger Price. Price is right. Roger, I'm trying to remember the name of the book. It was on that sheet. Something like When Science Meets Religion, or When Science Meets Judaism. And he talks about each plague. God says, I'm going to defeat the Egyptians and their gods, all their gods. And if you look at each plague was aimed at one of the major gods of Egypt. One by one, you go down the list, and it says, okay, so the Nile is the bloodstream of one of their gods, and the, I've forgotten, but each plague, there's a god of health and a god of, nope,
No,
okay.
I'm sorry, darling.
I'll do it some other time.
Yeah.
Egypt didn't last for God.
That's right, they had lots of gods.
So maybe it's not about us, it's about them.
Yeah.
Well, it certainly was about them in the first place,
Exactly, yeah.
yes.
So what I did want to talk about was a particularly peculiar pair of verses in the text about how we borrowed treasures from our Egyptian neighbors. So that is chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. Tell the people to borrow, each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers, objects of silver and gold. The Lord disposed the Egyptians favorably towards the people. Moreover, Moses himself was much esteemed in the land of Egypt, among Pharaoh's courtiers and among the people. Now, this passage comes between the 9th and 10th plagues. So you have to envision the situation here, according to the text, the Israelites went to their neighbors to borrow stuff. And the Egyptians said, great, and they gave away all their gold and silver. This is usually referred to as being a proof text for how it was when we built the tabernacle, that it was possible to come up with all the gold and silver and stuff that was needed. Okay, where did they get all this stuff in the wilderness? Well, the answer is you go back here and you see, oh, we got it from the Egyptians. Maida?
Is there any discussion as to why the Egyptians would have done that, considering that these people were their slaves? And looking at what slavery looks like in other parts of the world more recently, people certainly weren't giving their gold and their jewels to their slaves. Is there any explanation for this?
I don't know. I have a partial explanation of it myself. Go ahead.
So my translation doesn't say they borrowed, it says they asked. Well, God says, ask the people, like Sha'alti.
Yes.
That's a little softer, you know.
Yes, there are different.
Would you mind if I had your, as opposed to I like to borrow? And then the next verse says, like God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In verse 3 it says, God gave Moses favor in the eyes of the people of Israel. So now God's intervening in the other direction.
Right.
And if you read that verse in a certain way, it's like a spell was cast. And everyone's, well, Moses, he's such a fabulous fellow, we should give all our gold to his people.
Right.
So that'd be an explanation, I guess.
So I struggled with this, and I noticed there's an important detail earlier on the plague where there's going to be hail. And Moses is telling Pharaoh, this hail is going to kill all of the crops and animals that you have out there. And the text says the Egyptians who listened brought their animals into shelter, and the ones who didn't left the animals out. So I read that as telling me that this conflict between Moses and Pharaoh wasn't just Israelites on one side and Egyptians on the other side, that there were Egyptians who were paying attention and who had some sympathy with the Israelites, or who at least after a while recognized that Moses was speaking in the name of God, whoever they thought God was, since they were Egyptians. We see this in lots of political conflicts to this day, where initially there's one group of people fighting another group, but then there are people who start to be sympathetic with one side where they weren't previously involved or where they were previously on the other side. So I think the text is indicating, without necessarily saying God had to do it, that there were Egyptians who were beginning to really sympathize with the Israelites and seeing that there was injustice. And that matches the concept of the mixed multitude that this text also talks about. Who is the mixed multitude that went out from Egypt? And there are definitely scholars who argue that there were mixed marriages between Egyptians and Israelites, and we know this because in the wilderness we encounter mixed marriages. And where did those come from? They must have come from before the Exodus. And there are other people besides Israelites in the throng that leaves. So who were those other people? They included some Egyptians. Now, I will carry that one step further. If they were paying attention at the time of the hail, how much more would they be paying attention when the 10th plague was coming? And the Israelites were instructed, paint with blood on your doorposts so that your firstborn won't be lost. I would argue that there were Egyptians who did the same thing. So that in fact, God did not kill the firstborn of all the Egyptians. God killed the firstborn of the Egyptians who did not go along with Moses. And so when it says Moses was much esteemed in the land of Egypt. Why was Moses much esteemed in the land of Egypt? There are a couple of logical explanations for that. One is he was once a big shot in Egypt himself in the lifetime of the people who were still there. I mean, Moses left, but he came back. They knew who he was. He was a former prince of Egypt. So that's one reason. Another reason is they've been paying attention to what's been going on with all these plagues. They had to pay attention because they were suffering under these plagues. And they got the message that Moses was the real thing. And so that's why the text can say Moses was much esteemed and the people were sympathetic, and that would explain why they would be willing to give gifts to the Israelites. Or you can totally disagree with that. Yes?
How much are you guys, when you read this, holding in your head the narrative, and also, if there was a historic Exodus, what that would have looked like in the relationship between the two? Because if there was a historic one, it probably would have looked like the Haitian Rebellion, and then how would we canonize that story of ours? And are you guys thinking about what actually would have happened?
Are you asking me personally?
Anyone. I just like, because, because it wouldn't have been, like, if there was a crop failure, maybe they went and, it was resistance or terrorism, they went and salted the fields or something, and that's maybe what that would have looked like in, a non-religious uprising. Like, how do we tell that story after the game of telephone,
Well, I will briefly give my answer, which is that I don't think about that question from that point of view. I read the story as it is presented to us and try to understand, what is this story teaching me? I don't think of it in terms of, oh, this must have happened, or, oh, this couldn't have happened. I say, this is our myth, okay? And if you're familiar with the notion of myth, the myth is not the opposite of truth. It's totally separate from that, okay? A myth is true in a certain sense in that it's teaching us something, okay? But the literal text of what happened is not something that I judge for itself, okay? Because, let's face it, I'm a modern human being who finds it difficult to believe that crazy stuff like this happens. And I also don't buy the alternative view that, oh yes, we have a scientific explanation for why suddenly frogs would be doing this or hail would be, Sure, you can come up with a theory, but it doesn't help me any. It doesn't enlighten me.
That's a fantastic answer. I think I agree with you. And just one thought I had was when you asked if what God did was right or wrong in this instance, and the thing that struck it to me was that what he did was true in a mythological sense. It just feels like what would have happened as far as the conception of God that
Yeah.
I would say that's why the stories have persisted this long, because if they're not literal, they're mythologically true.
Yes. Yes,
So
Tom.
in response to that, people like Richard Elliott Friedman, struggle with the Exodus, and he tries to explain it as basically an exodus of the Levite tribe in his book. And that's all that happened. The rest of Israel was already in Israel. That's one reason why the Levites arrived late and had no land, had no portion. They ended up being cities and things like that. And he has a whole book on this about trying to rationalize some exodus, because he wants to believe in an exodus, but not an exodus of 2 million people crossing the Red Sea, which would take, how long would that take?
And,
Weeks, a month, I don't know how long.
well, it may be the Sea of Reeds and not the Red Sea.
Well, I think there's some value in tension. So, you think about Hamlet. I mean, you could argue it'd be a lot quicker if he just killed his dad in the first scene. Or his uncle, I mean. But, the tension in the play is what draws us in. And so I think resolving tension sometimes can drain the purpose of a story. And this story certainly creates a lot of tension.
Steve, did you want to say something? Oh, one moment, Steve. Go ahead, please.
I'd like to go back to one of the earlier sentences, and maybe the Hebrew is different, but it says tell the people to borrow from each man and woman.
Yes.
Borrow implies, or specifically, that the item is going to be returned.
That's right. But
Are the Jews being asked to buy?
so it's a translation issue, and maybe my wife has.
It just, and actually, Friedman says, and Friedman translates as ask. Just ask your neighbor for this stuff.
Because that's a big difference.
It is.
How would that work?
Well, every translation is an interpretation.
That's
Somebody decided it meant borrow, but
The
it
Hebrew
just,
word is the word for ask.
the Hebrew, as I understand it, just means ask.
Yeah, I mean, Summer talks about this issue of translation, and that all translation is interpretation. And he says, and that's the problem even with the whole construction of the Torah, which is that there's a certain amount of interpretation that had to be made. Different people had different interpretations of events. And for example, what happened at Sinai, we had to translate God's words, which weren't even ordinary words in any language, according to some scholars. We had to translate what God said into our own language. And that means that we could easily not understand everything completely. So, yeah, that's a problem. Is it borrow? Is it ask? I prefer ask because it's somewhat less, what's the word? No, I just mean it's not as sneaky, okay? If we asked for stuff as opposed to borrowing it. But, I mean, it's kind of scary to think that people would say, oh, sure, here's this stuff, and then the next day they lost their firstborn. That would be a real downer. I'm not sure how much more I want to say about the killing of the firstborn, except to say that after all these years, I don't think any of us has a really nice, peaceful justification for God killing all these people. I thought about it as punishment, by the way, not of the firstborn, but of the families. One thing that we learn very early in the Torah is that the firstborn belong to God. The text tells us that explicitly. The firstborn of everything, the first fruits of the field, the firstborn of the animals. God says the firstborn belong to me. So God is collecting the firstborn of the Egyptians. That's his. Now, what happens to a firstborn child when God takes that child? We don't know. I mean, because we don't know what happens after death. So we don't know what happens to the firstborn. But what I do know is that the people who suffer from the death of a child are the survivors of that. They're the ones who really suffer. Whether the child suffers or not, that's only God knows. So this is a punishment of the Egyptians, not of their firstborn themselves. Having said that, though, that doesn't make me feel that much better. I find this a very difficult concept, and I'm not going to attempt to resolve it. I mean, I think that's why we have this Torah study, is so we can struggle with this and say, okay, so what does this tell us? What is the right thing to do? I mean, I think our tradition teaches us one answer, which is to save a child is to save an entire world. We believe in that, and we act on that. And we act on it either because of or despite what it says in the text. The loss of a child is the loss of a whole world, and the saving of a child is the saving of a whole world. And it's the fact that we have principles like that we learn by studying Torah, that makes it so valuable to do so, I think. That's why I come back week after week.
Thank you, David.
Thank you all.
Sure.
much easier than examining every single issue. Every time it comes up. There's a middle ground somewhere that is gotta be livable and.
The last 10 years, the computer noise and
And even if there wasn't the Egyptian wealthy families, there were certainly Egyptians of additional modest means that,
We're talking
again,
work with. I have
Jews.
10 different piles
a lot
of
of
homes.
means.
People who recently
very rough.
who I have given to, who I think are wonderfully worthwhile organizations, and sometime in my life I donated to them, and they put me on a mailing list to the point where every single week I get something. I mean, it's the Holocaust Museum, it's hospital, you know, hospitals abroad program. Doctors Without Borders.
David, very nice.
It's
Great presentation and,
all kinds of political organizations.
lots of the
all
opportunity
kinds
to do
of
something like what you did.
They're very
10 different piles.
I appreciate the,
3 or 4 or
I
5
appreciate the effort and the time you put into it, because I know how
And I decided I was gonna donate,
together.
this year, and I just set everything aside.
It certainly is, I'm sure you
And I'm really
can be split between the
I
two.
just decided, you know, whether I should do it or
I
not do
was
it.
at one time, where, I was saving them.
ACLU, yeah.
To the end of the year.
The Nature Conservancy, I mean, hummingbirds and bees.
It's a great weather.
I know, and how important is my receipt $25 from?
Well,
We were flying with that plane, and they always were very fast.
I could send something to every,
Just
an envelope that came my way. But I know now, I have one.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a nice building.
He did it
The
all.
first floor is that are open, airy, and.
Right, well, this is good, that's a good number, but it's very, I sorted them all out, I just put them all in one spot. So, what's the word? Living my soul.
Actually, yeah, what I'd
I'm
like
always
to
questioning,
Well, depends on the kind of
put that out.
if they're doing radiology, that's a lot of meetings, and so,
Well, I mean, it was fun.
That's why it's so attractive to have someone tell you what to do. And that baptize guys.
That's right.
But then when you do both sides of the story.
Thank you.
You're welcome, anytime you,
type the cells.
anytime you're confused about translation.
Huge.
I'm no scholar, but I have a certain vocabulary. There's so much in this English, it's just weird. I know, and sometimes it does, and sometimes I'm like, wait a minute. Because what I'm missing is a key feature of what's
I think bring everything.
He doesn't want to spend, he doesn't want to spend a lot of time.
That was exactly
in a
the
soul like
point.
Yeah, exactly.
that. Because some of our doctors relate to that.
Now, Maya, she knows
She's a native, right?
no, she is.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, she's a native. He
She
lives
lives somewhere else.
His version.
I think she was born in Russia.
she referred us to somebody, I'm trying to remember, Bill somebody, I've forgotten her last name, but it's a woman. She
Oh,
said,
you're right, I
she
wrote it
said-
down, and I
went
took
to
me a
that.
while to realize that she was talking about female commentary.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this person thing was a little an issue for
her.
her as she, and so I realized that.
So
Yes,
I
I
went
wrote
to her
her.
website and I
I know.
found a lecture, and I've only listened to the first 10, 15 minutes, and it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And what she does now, she actually has, the first slide I saw that had any substance to it. It was like 5 different translations of Psalm 68, verse 1, or something like that. And which, you know, so they all have, it's, you know, there's the King James and the, whatever, you know, whatever those standard translations are, and she gets to the JPS, which is completely different. And refers to,
Is it the little one that we changed?
yeah.
Jewish public.
Yeah. Yes, that's JPS. And if you look at that one, that verse, the verb is in the feminine plural, which the other translations all just ignore. You know, it just says those who speak, and it's like the women who speak, and she points that out, it's really, you know, I can't wait to see the rest of this lecture.
Yes, interesting. I don't know, I think that, go ahead.
The earliest revelations I had about translation was, as a kid, we had a Bible reading every day at the start of school. Where I was. No, this is public school, New Jersey. And so a different kid would have to read it. So the most popular.
Every day?
Every day.
I was also anti
Yeah, we had the Lord's Prayer.
But that was the extent of.
Somebody was supposed to read, so typically somebody was reading some, most popular way was some 100 written other things as well. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Serve the Lord with gladness, come before his presence with singing. And this is the King James translation. Know ye, the Lord, he is God. He that hath made us, and not we ourselves. So I remember that from when I was a kid. As an adult, I found out
However you want to
we
handle it, that's
ourselves
fine.
is a total focus translation because it's,
Do it on your own.
because there are 2 words, low. One is not, and the other is not. Is. Right. So we are his, not we are his. We are his. I mean, so it's clearly an error. Because they got the wrong Hebrew words. So that's when I realized that, okay, translation is a big deal.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, which I really was rampant as we were growing up. You know, when we were 20 or 30 and when that movement came in. I think that there.
Okay, thanks again for your concern. Take care.
No, I don't think that
Yeah.
the women's commentary, which is 40 years old now, commands the same respect that it used to, or it used to
No,
be.
the thing is,
Everybody was talking about it, you know.
yeah, well, but that's because
It gives me
it's normal, it's not normalized.
It's normalized.
It's straight now.
It's not, yeah,
That's
it's
right.
not that we don't respect it anymore, it's
It's
that we don't
right.
need it so much.
People
Because
are
we,
much more aware
yeah,
of he and she, and then it's led to what all the pronouns that are supposed to follow your name and the whole transgender movement, right?
Yeah.
yeah.
So maybe that's what's probably.
Yeah, the pronouns are appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know all about them.
Shabbat shalom, stay warm.
Yeah.
See you
Tuesday, Minion, yes. I'm gonna be at Rogers, session on Monday night about Jewish thinkers.
Oh, yeah, they changed that from last week to this week. I know they keep changing that every 2 weeks orders.
It's in person and Zoom, or and whatever it is.
Jewish thinkers, modern Jewish
Right.
thinkers.
But
That's the name of it. And I've been going.
I don't know, the next person is gonna be Herzl.
Yeah, so do
But I don't know if we're gonna, sometimes he sort of does a more retrospective on where we've been and.
He is able to turn it into things that we understand.
Yeah. Rosenzweig was the last one. And then the next one
It does
is
well.
Chris Herzl. Yeah, Herzl's an interesting guy.
I take notes, he says the same thing, but I understand them differently. So, that's why I think it's not the words on the page.
How they come up with
More,
things.
Well, and
yeah, it's more how we understand.
the,
And we change as we grow.
never quite embrace the thought of
Well, I know. Feel it, right?
Yes, he feels.
me that
Thank you, David.
sacred, that, that's how you follow it.
You know why? Why?
believe that or not.
Was it the preparation or the actual?
Of someone
It,
even if you don't believe
that
that,
was good, I got hearing aids.
you may say, I may say certain things that I take away
And so I went out on those days, and helped with my hair and my tires, and
understand it.
get that, and I did it.
It's really just
Some
get
did
the
it,
different,
and
for me, it is
5
anyway,
days
good to
later, I
get
had
the
to get
different
done
steps.
again, I was like, keep coming on the farm.
If you're ever interested in that group, I can tell you
They
about it.
fixed it.
It's really.
And now
good.
yesterday
Brings,
it came up.
he brings a little snack, you
But I
know.
went to
It's very.
Health Fair last night.
Yeah, I talked to Jackie.
Yes, I
Yeah,
do.
and,
Just like sort of Rabbi Klein was saying the
it
other
was,
day.
it was interesting. Took a lot of effort, it's cold out there.
Yeah.
Good talking.
I didn't
Have a good
go.
weekend.
So I stayed home, and I, didn't get a lot done I wanted to at home, and I did all the laundry, and I even ran the vacuum cleaner and cleaned a little bit, you know, but I have to get that mess on my desk to figure out how to open an ACH. Do you know what that is, an ACH? It's an automatic withdrawal, an auto pay.
Oh,
Because they tax their buildings now on water and sewer, but they're not billing us directly. And
Oh, that's
the
a-
management company is, and they're not even sending me a bill monthly. They send our building a list of what category you're in according to the size of your unit, and then what percentage
yes.
of the building's water and
Yes.
sewer then that you owe. And so it was like, I paid after 2 months in July and August, and then I didn't know how much to pay, and so I didn't, and I thought I had opened it, and we never got a bill. So I just got finished paying 4 months worth, and I've got to figure out how to electronically do this.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, my kids have been sick, and so, Josh has been sick, and, no, Ava and I think Ava and Christina came down with the flu.
Oh dear.
Not to mention, every time there's no school, there's no daycare, and they have to work. So they run around taking care of the kids. Oh, I have a meeting at 10 o'clock, you take the kids. Oh, I have a meeting at 11 o'clock, I'll take the, do you know what I mean? Their lives are
Yes.
crazy.
Yes.
And if they would walk down and bring the children to me, I'd be happy to take care of them. If they think that because I don't hear well and I can't run around after them, that I'm not capable, and frankly, I would be exhausted after one day with the kids. I'm sure I could do it, but they don't trust me as much as I could be, because there's no reason to warrant over this.
No.
good for you.